Yeah.
Some time between them. Yeah, I mean, I was in my 20s when it came out, and I was so.
I'll let you do it.
I would like be at the place with my friend. Capital Hill, yeah. Get my pre-bought copy, and then I would like go home and stay up all night reading it.
Welcome.
Hi,
Hi, how are you doing? Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, all, and I've also given at University. Right. So, I don't necessarily feel like I'm not going to go on any like one and even do right. Hogwarts park, an alley in the other park, and isn't that cute? She couldn't buy it. He's like, I'm gonna get one. I was like, yeah, I'll buy you one, but any other random stuff you want to buy, yeah, you can use your elections. So, Harry Potter for Halloween, it's going to be super easy. Yeah. But yeah, but I haven't bought it. Like kind of right. Like maybe it will go into color. Yeah. But yeah, it's fun. And so in the Diagon Alley, they have a new ride. It's called like Escape from Gringotts, I think. And he fits the height requirement for that one. So I'm very excited because they built it so that like the dragon on top of Gringotts that like breathes out fire every like 10 minutes. It's okay. I think the one in Florida is a little bit more immersive. Yeah. Yeah. But they're not very different, like, honestly. Yeah. Florida, kind of like where they put theme parks, you know, in popular places. So, yeah. New York is one of the only public. I was so excited to wear it. I've like had it for 3 days and it's pretty soft. Yeah. The reviews on it are like bananas crazy, and it was like 30% off. So it was finally like, yeah. Yeah, I was telling Shannon, I have the black one.
That would be good.
Right, yes. Oh, these are like my computer ones. I knew I was. No, they just email. Send it to CPAP.
Right, that's what I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. It's just our general,
so like my, never.
not.
Oh, okay. I was like,
Okay, yeah. No,
yeah, but I think that I mean, like, because I had to like this. Sorry, that's true. Yeah. Feel free to be there. Yeah.
We can start at 5 after video. Good. It might trickle in.
Yeah. wonder if our smiling CTAC faces are up, so that you might have people come in later, and if they come in later, yeah, it's easier for people to begin than it is to begin the front. Okay, so that's, yeah, no, I think that's great. I was just. That was huge, actually. I feel like that when we lost our water bottle, to inevitably. And that one has quite the sticker collection too, so. I was all going to yeah, no, I think it's great.
In the house. This is the
I want to 19 and 20.
You're got 19 minutes.
Hi, everyone. You all hear me okay? Great, awesome. So thank you so much for being here today. My name is Francesca Tripodi. I'm a senior researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, or what we refer to as CTAP. And I have to say, this is one of my favorite parts about being at this center. It is a true interdisciplinary space where we can bring world-class scholars from so many different fields together in a common conversation. And I think that's a very rare, very cool thing. That being said, it also sometimes makes it more challenging when you're introducing people who in their respective fields are so well known. You're like, why am I introducing this person? But in the field of sociology, Dr. Victor Ray is a scholar who does not need much of an introduction. He serves as the F. Wendell Miller Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and African American Studies at the University of Iowa, and holds his PhD and MA in sociology at Duke, where he worked with Eduardo Bonilla Silva on research surrounding race and inequality. His groundbreaking article, A Theory of Racialized Organizations, published by the American Sociological Review, has already been viewed and downloaded by close to 75,000 people and cited over 800 times. Now, this article was published in 2019, so this to give you an idea of its impact. The scholastic importance of his work has been rewarded with grants and fellowships with the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the Brookings Institute. And in addition to his theoretical contributions on race and organizations, Dr. Ray has also written on racial discrimination inside police departments and written extensively on how race shapes social processes that we might consider as race control. What I love actually most though about Dr. Ray's research is that his writing transcends boundaries of academia. He publishes widely and has done lots of op-eds and guest columns in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Inside Higher Ed, Newsweek, the Boston Review, Gawker, and CNN. And it's in the spirit of public engagement that we're all here today. He wrote a book, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, but also on some theory that relates to this book on critical race theory, why it matters, and why you should care. This is a concise and extremely accessible understanding of a term that has been increasingly weaponized to try and curtail racial progress in the United States. It's also the only book that I'm aware of that had a viral tweet lead to a contract. So it's very exciting to me, I think, as well. In lieu of an honorarium, Dr. Ray actually allowed us to purchase copies of his book, and they're available here today. His request is that students get copies first, so faculty wait in line, make sure we don't we have extra copies. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr.
So I want to thank everyone in attendance, particularly Francesca Tripodi for inviting me and the kind introduction, and Andrea Lopez for helping arrange today. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my book project on critical race theory, but not too much because there you read it. And then I'm going to talk about an idea I've had since finishing up the book. So to start, stories and narratives are really central to critical race theory. So I'm going to open with a personal narrative. I was 2 years old the first time the cops were called on my family. At a parade in downtown Pittsburgh, my uncle Harold had lifted me to his shoulder so I could see over the crowd. Behaving as loving uncles do led someone to jump to the conclusion that my dark-skinned uncle had abducted me, the light-skinned toddler. Someone called the police. Kidnappers aren't known for taking stolen children to parades or anywhere with large crowds. Nonetheless, the police questioned my uncle, letting us go when they were satisfied that we were indeed a family. Variations of this scene repeated throughout my life, from infancy till now. When I was about 10, a white woman driving past our trailer called the police on my dad for being in the yard, again criminalizing family joy. As teenagers, white clerks followed my brother around stores where I walked unbothered. And even now, if my father and I are together, we often get asked if and how we know each other. I think these experiences are a microcosm of America's broader racial system. The assumption that my uncle and I weren't family is tied to our nation's peculiar racial categorization system with its singular one-drop rule and its long history of bans on interracial marriage. Such bans would have outlawed my parents' union and were intended to prevent my birth. Assuming my Black male caretakers were dangerous and deviant rather than loving and conscientious reflects the routine criminalization of Black people's family lives and gendered stereotypes about Black masculinity. And as a seemingly endless series of videos of violence against unarmed Black men has shown, calling the police, falsely accusing a Black man of stealing a child, puts lives at risk, regardless of the fact. By connecting individual experiences to broader patterns of racial inequality, stories like mine have helped shape critical race. Critical race theory recognizes narratives influence our understanding of the world and uses stories as a kind of empathetic bridge across racial divides. Stories can help outsiders understand and connect with the unfairness, capriciousness, and cruelty of life. Critical race theorists recognize that narratives in and of themselves may not be evident. So they couple these stories with meticulous research highlighting America's profound racial inequality, showing how race and racism shape people's lives. By highlighting people of color's stories of navigating and surviving American racism, critical race theory provides perspectives often conspicuously absent from mainstream books, movies, and one reason I wrote this book is people are trying to erase and turn back relatively minor inroads critical race theorists made in getting these stories. In today's talk, I argue that critical race theory is being targeted because it is an effective, useful, and potentially accessible body of scholarship that everyone interested in anti-racism should have access to. Second, I think concepts from critical race theory can help explain why it is being caricatured and targeted. When I learned the core ideas developed by critical race theorists, I had a language to describe and understand sometimes hidden processes of discrimination, exclusion, and white supremacy that shape our social world. I learned that race was a social construction, which helped to explain the peculiar history shaping my racial identity. The concept of structural racism allowed me to see how race was used to divvy up resources from classrooms to boardrooms, sometimes intentionally, but often as a byproduct of quote-unquote non-racial action. In other words, ideas from critical race theory did exactly what good ideas are supposed to do, allowing me to better see, understand, and navigate. One goal of my book is to help spread these good ideas by making key concepts of critical race theory accessible to a broad audience. I think they can help explain the contemporary backlash. And as I'll outline in the second part of the talk, we've entered what I think Derek Bell would call a period of interest divergence. There are an increasing group of white Americans who see their interests as fundamentally different from those of their non-white fellows. Before I move on, I just want to be clear that I do think there are good faith critiques of critical race theory and critical race theorists. Those of us who use critical race theory argue amongst ourselves all the time, and academics are a false bunch. It's our job. But critical race theory's most prominent contemporary opponents aren't interested in confronting America's history of equality. The groups promoting the anti-critical race theory hysteria aren't interested in solving racial inequality. They're manipulating racism for political advantage. Critical race theory is a set of ideas that help explain the creation and persistence of racial inequality. Theory developed in part to explain why the monumental legal victories of the civil rights movement, for instance, the Brown v. Board education decision outlined state-sponsored segregation, didn't always lead to lasting improvements in the lives of people of color in the US. By the late 70s and early 80s, it was clear that a backlash to the civil rights movement had started and was gaining traction. Schools that had been forced to open their doors to Black students in the wake of the Brown ruling were resegregated. This resegregation continues, with some public schools now as or more segregated than before Brown. The impact of anti-discrimination law in the workplace is also waning or reversing. Occupational stall. Best contemporary evidence shows that discrimination against Black men in entry-level jobs hasn't decreased since the late 1980s. In emerging business integrity. Conservative think tanks waged an all-out war on affirmative action in higher education, characterizing policies designed to slightly intervene in decades of explicit exclusion from white colleges as reverse. White hostility to policies designed to create racial inequality weren't targeted because these policies work. They were targeted because hoping to explain the backlash to the civil rights. Group of law students and legal scholars, including Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Mary Masuda, and Patricia Williams, among others, turned to the work of Derek Bell. Bell was a gifted lawyer who worked on landmark civil rights cases and wrote a path-breaking casebook on race in the law. Drawing on Bell's work, these burgeoning critical race theorists saw existing explanations of the relationship between race and the law is inadequate to explain the backlash. Rather than seeing the law as separate from racial power, the neutral umpire just calling balls and strikes, these critical race theorists understood the law as a tool that occasionally empowered people, but often advanced white social security. Once critical race theory was established in the law, ideas spread beyond law schools to impact scholars in political sciences and humanities, and we can talk about this relationship a little complicated. Given its roots as an insurgent intellectual framework explaining racial retrenchment, critical race theory became a perfect target for our current backlash. 2020's Black Lives Matter protests following George Floyd's murder were the largest civil rights protests in American history. Record numbers of white Americans expressed support for Black Lives Matter. Protests pushed some corporations to finally acknowledge the structural racism problem that they may be in. Following the protests, anti-racist books topped bestseller lists, sports teams dropped racist names and mascots, college and universities once again stated their commitment to diversity. The scale, demands, and impact of these protests terrified some people invested in the racial status quo, and you don't need to take my word for it. So Christopher Rufo, the conservative activist most often credited with creating the moral panic around he claimed his concerns about the protests following George Floyd's murder motivated him to start the moral panic. Rufo claimed to have read some of the works that became popular in the wake of death and traced the citations back to critical race theorists. He decided that critical race theory was, quote, the perfect weapon for beating back protesters' movements, in part because he felt that ideas like political correctness were outdated. Critical race theory had the advantage of being something that we taught ourselves. The anti-critical race theory panic has been effective. According to PEN America, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting the expression, legislatures in 36 states have proposed 137 bills that would limit teaching about race, gender, and American history. 19 censorship bills have become law in the past year. There is an echo of white resistance to the civil rights movement. white parents protested physical desegregation then. Now white parents are protesting perceived slight desegregation of the curriculum in response to backlash. Former President Donald Trump issued his executive order banning diversity trainings on September 22nd, 2022, after seeing Christopher Rufo discuss the supposed dangers of critical race theory on Fox. This helped transform hype around critical race theory into a full-fledged moral. Like prior backlashes against perceived racial progress, such as the conspiracy of birtherism that challenged Obama's qualifications for presidency, the anti-critical race theory fervor revives many of the worst habits of American anti-intellectuals. McCarthyism, embracing a mythological past, equating racial justice and communism. And the funders stoking this moral panic hope to advance a grab bag of long-standing conservative policies, including the privatization of public education and further erosion of Black voting rights. Think tanks like the Manhattan Institute, which consistently works to undermine Black voting preferences, and the billionaire right-wing donors behind this campaign seek electoral victory by making latent racism mandatory. As someone who studies critical race theory, it's striking to me how many of the central ideas that contemporary backlash affirm. And it might actually be funny if it wasn't so dangerous. Outlawing discussions of structural racism is a type of structural. Forcing educators to avoid basic truths about the history of law. News articles featuring reactionary white parents as a stand-in for all parents treat whiteness as an assumed default category. Stories omitting the impact of this moral panic on parents and children of color for race minority perspectives, showing the need for counter narratives that recover marginalized stories. States legally mandating that teachers reverse marginal progress they have made in creating inclusive curriculum shows the fragility of racial progress. Critical race theorists also analyzed dogmas, racially coded language like Reagan's welfare. It emerged to signal racial animus once explicit slurs became true. The moral panic has, in some corners, turned critical race theory itself into a dogma. It stands in for a host of alleged pathologies associated with color. Finally, many critics, like President Trump, claim that critical race theory is tearing apart the fabric of America. And I think these critics are telling on. To the extent that racism is woven into the American fabric, it's true that critical race theory yeah. But critical race theory doesn't want to destroy America. It does want to squarely reckon with the way American racism is destroyed. So since I finished the book, I've been thinking about what the success of these attacks on anti-racist scholarship says about trends in contemporary American politics. After all, attempts to stricken Black and anti-racist political thought from classrooms, libraries, and public forums have often been a part of American history. From attacks on abolitionist newspapers to the attempted suppression of the Black Panther speakers on campuses in the 1960s. And critical race theory itself is no stranger to attacks and dismissals from both within the academy and without. Past offensives against critical race theory have landed in blows, such as Bill Clinton's revoking Lanny Ganier's assistant attorney general nomination when conservative said she was racist. But the current crop of propagandists has, in my estimation, been more successful in misconstruing critical race theory and setting the right. Ideas from critical race theory can also help explain why this moral panic over a 40-year-old theoretical framework. Particularly, Derek Bell's interest convergence, which claims that racial progress for Black Americans typically occurs when there is an equal or greater payoff. Interest convergence sees American racial progress ebbing or flowing in reaction to broader trends, providing a guide as to why the attacks against critical race and the broader retreat from civil rights that these attacks are coupled with are so potent. So to explain interest convergence, I want to back up for a minute and discuss mainstream narratives of this. So the story of the civil rights movement that many of you probably learned is often told as a story of inevitable progress. Few reluctant heroes, weary Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat, Dr. King marching to the tree, held white Americans to their professed ideals of equal opportunity, sometimes against odds. Organizations responded to movement pressures by opening their doors to formerly excluded folks of color who had fought for full inclusion. Because of these selfless activists, race declined in significance as a factor explaining divergent chances, and some proclaimed the end of racial history. Racial issues are always improving, with the nation moving towards a more union. Extending rights to formerly excluded racial minorities is seen as inevitable. Contemporary inequalities are seen as an unfortunate residue from a less enlightened time. This view of the abiding impact of the civil rights movement is, I think, beautiful and compelling, and this view is also partial and real. Critical race theory provides a polar view of this issue, noting that reactionaries quickly moved to undermine the freedom-expanding triumphs of rights. Yes, the Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act created legal protections against routine racial discrimination and increased access to voting rights, jobs, schools, and housing. But these advances were met with a set of legal and political strategies designed to halt or reverse the expansion of rights. For instance, President Nixon brought the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, equating desegregation with discrimination against whites by claiming forced integration of housing or education was just as wrong. President Reagan made the Department of Justice ground zero for the counter-revolution, so hobbling the enforcement of civil rights law that the NAACP went to Congress and asked them to abolish the Civil Rights Division because they said it was doing more harm than good. Critical race theorists drew on Wendell's work to explain how the law, a weapon that movement lawyers had wielded so effectively against supremacy, is now beating back civil rights. To explain this back and forth over racial progress, Bell looked abroad. Critical race theory is typically thought of as a domestic theory of racism, and for the most part, it's true. But Derek Bell's genius didn't stop at the border. Bell used the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, to explain the influence of global geopolitics on a decision that was seemingly about race and schools. Bell argued that Brown resulted from several trends. Black protests and stalled Southern economic development are necessary but not sufficient conditions for the court to overturn the conviction. International competition with the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of the proxy states. Soviet propaganda highlighted American hypocrisy on racism and used this as a recruiting tool to bring the colonizing states into their sphere of influence. The State Department and the Department of Justice recognized the importance of desegregation for America's international standing, and the Attorney General Brown agreed to support desegregation in the Brown case. Interest convergence is a core critical race theory. It replaces the mythology of inexorable racial progress with a realistic notion of political change happening in conflict over inclusion and global reputation. Like benevolence or a commitment to equality in the abstract didn't lead to racial progress. America's Cold War era needs to save face internationally created space for fundamental changes in the domestic order. Although Bell was, of necessity, focused on politics, one distillable principle from Bell's analysis that the rational calculus of benefit on the international stage shapes American racial equality. I think rising global authoritarianism has made such face saving less necessary, creating the conditions for country divergence. All right, behind, sorry. So America's domestic racial politics don't happen internationally. Bell saw the global condemnation of American structural racism, pushing the country towards greater inclusion. Today's American right is emboldened and ideologically allied authoritarians consolidating power elsewhere. Contrary to the end of history thesis that greeted the dissolution of communism with a prediction of democracy through the spread of markets, new authoritarian states emerged. Markets are independent of the political system in which they operate, and the promised theory of liberal internationalism gave way to authoritarian leaders who use trade, prop up and empower the regime. As the American right embraces regimes such as Putin's Russia, which Trump and others on the right have repeatedly and even recently praised, they adopt and adapt repressive strategies such as the criminalization of protests and the demonization of the media. In short, the international decline in political rights shapes interest divergence at home, as a significant minority of whites see their interests as fundamentally zero-sum and interpret non-white gains as their loss. Bell's account of interest convergence argued that Southern economic stagnation and Black protests were decades-old problems before the Supreme Court's decision. Alone, these issues weren't enough to convince the court to end segregation. Once continued segregation threatened America's rural reputation, the cost of domestic racial authoritarianism began to outweigh the benefit. Contemporary domestic trends are a rough parallel. Is economic inequality and demographic projections showing that the United States will become a quote majority minority country at mid-century are not new. What is new? Rising international authoritarianism means the external checks on the persecution of minorities at home, which Bell argued were decisive for interest convergence, were broken down. Conservatives opposed to the civil rights movement planted anti-democratic seeds whose fruit they are attempting to reap is the external checks on a racial authoritarian road. Scholars such as Timothy Snyder and journalists like Ann Applebaum have noted that authoritarian states adopt similar tactics. Tactics include sham democratic performances, elections with public competition, and foregone conclusion. I would point to the US South under Jim Crow for a homegrown variant of elections that functions as authoritarians also relentlessly pursue exclusionary national politics. In Anderson's famous terms, the creation of an imagined community, drawing on a mythic past that supposedly pure citizens intended. Control or manipulation of a society's information infrastructure, state-sponsored propaganda, or erasing actual history from seminars and syllabi hold these trends. By, quote, flooding the zone with shit, as Steve Bannon put it, this information can operate as a boundary maintenance tool, showing who is with or against the regime. These movements borrow from one another's playbook, and the script includes suppression of liberatory knowledge projects from internal minority groups. Snyder points to Putin's Russia as a model for the types of laws designed to create a, quote, mandatory view of historical events that justifies contemporary distributions of power and ensures the powerful are insulated from uncomfortable facts. In Poland, the hard-right Law and Justice Party introduced a law limiting discussions of the country's contribution to the Holocaust. Both Putin's Russia and Viktor Orban's Hungary targeted teaching about LGBTQ issues with laws that would look at home and Ron DeSantis, Florida. And indeed, after I wrote this, my Ron DeSantis is now towards Hungary. Attacks on critical race theory are a part of this broader movement, as authoritarians always target knowledge showing the supposed coherence of their community is indeed imagined. Mike Davis wrote of Putin's conviction that, quote, the present must be smashed in order to make an imaginary past future. Davis was speaking of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but this sentiment is found among authoritarians hoping to make their countries great again through state propaganda. Laws targeting critical race theory are authoritarianism with American characteristics, propaganda arm of a broader movement targeting marginalized rights. Every feature of authoritarianism I've outlined above have corollaries in contemporary American conservative movements. Voted by the success of their ideological co-travelers abroad, repressive conservatism has turned inward, following lines well worn in the very history they hope to suppress. The erosion of Black voting rights recalls the worst episodes of Jim Crow, where white supremacy was protected through exclusion from the franchise. Trump's lies about a supposedly stolen election are a poor copy of the sham elections of foreign authoritarians. Pining for a mythological history of white innocence is seen in calls to make America great again and his pundits such as Tucker Carlson launder white nationalist talking points of a great replacement. Protests for Black Lives Matter have been met with the celebration of vigilante violence, and the GOP has reduced or eliminated punishments for driving into protest. This tactic was cribbed from white nationalist forums and used during the neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville to murder Heather Heyer and injure several. So today I've argued that ideas from critical race theory, particularly Derek Bell's interest convergence theory, can help explain why the backlash has been so effective. Critics of critical race theory are right that critiques of structural inequality and discussions of America's history of racial totalitarianism threaten their power. Critical race theory draws on historical fact and empirical social science to show how racism is built into seemingly neutral structures of coercion, such as criminal law, and consent, such as the media. This focus on structural racism is a better explanation for the intractability of racial inequality than individualistic and victim-blaming mainstream accounts. I think it is precisely the historical verifiability of critical race theory that so unsettles those committed to a narrative of white innocence. Rising authoritarianism, the threat of international embarrassment, homegrown repressive conservatism turned inward, seeking dangers to the nation hidden away in children's books. What this moral panic means for Americans of color is, as always, an open question. But I am worried about the Supreme Court's past session and the next one, with highly consequential cases around affirmative action and voting rights on the docket. The notion of interest convergence is often criticized for being overly pessimistic because it notes that the racial norm in the US isn't steady progress, but a repressive equilibrium of white dominance. By mischaracterizing critical race, conservatives are hoping to ensure interest divergence. But I think the interests at the center of the theory don't flow naturally from group membership. Collective interests are constructed through social movements that create cohesion or division, and I think that is what many on the right are. Bell saw the struggle against racial domination, regardless of the possibility of victory, as liberative. And that hope that collective struggle will overturn unjust power, I think, has always been the real target of attacks on power. Thank you.
So we can open it up for questions that you might have for Victor. Don't be shy. Daniel, go ahead.
Interest, convergence, and divergence in the Cold War. That's my question is, pulling a show like book bans and not teaching racial history is actually widely unsupported. People actually want that to be taught in schools. But what you say now with like Joe Biden in his speech about America and American democracy, we say interest convergence has returned to at least a piece of the American electorate. That's why they're more supportive for like the voter rights bills and other acts.
Victor, would you mind just reiterating the question? So for the one.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
So I think there were. Let me make sure I get it. The question is, do I think interest convergence has returned with Biden's speech? So you open this question with a discussion about sort of polling on parents and these issues. And I will say you are right, but it depends on the question wording of the poll. So if you poll parents and you say, do you want your kids to learn about like racism and slavery in American history, they say yes. If you poll parents and say, do you want them to know about critical race theory, they say no, or they're unsure, right? A majority. I don't remember the exact numbers. And so that I think that that's evidence of sort of like the success of the propaganda campaign. But as far as interest convergence, I think that's an open question. So I think on the right, probably not. I think if you see the sort of the reaction to Biden's speech on the right was like kind of unhinged, right? Like they were comparing him to Hitler and like this and Hitler stuff. So I don't think on the right, and I think this is largely like I make the case here why the right is on mainstream. Right? I think one of the things that Bell argued is like, you know, around Brown v. Board or around other instances of interest convergence, Bell is very clear, and you know, like people are like critical race theory demonizes all white people. Bell is like, look, there have always been white Americans who on principle were dedicated to and like I recognize that. He's like, just a lot of times like they lost. Right? Like they lost like that sometimes minority, sometimes majority of folks like didn't have sort of political will to win, right? Or situation. So yeah, I don't know. It's an open question, right?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Priscilla.
Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to stand because I can't project really well. I have a long question, but I was really fascinated by what you said about Derek Bell, connecting about versus education to the Soviet Union, the Cold War. In my work, I do a lot of like debunking of the myth of the anti-racist utopia and like Union and East Germany. So I was wondering, you know, the end of history, you mentioned everyone decided, okay, communism lost, right? There are no more grand narratives, arts that's all out the window. So I was wondering, you know, when I think about current anti-racist movements in Europe, England, Germany, France, they're really interesting conversations, which, you know, arguably has a lot of different origins, Africa, Latin America, indigenous West. I was wondering, is part of the problem that there's like European model for an anti-racist unity that Americans, you know, are comparing them? Is that what the U.S. would need to kind of, I guess, for the shame, you know, again, to do better?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. So is part of the problem that there's not a European model with American anti-racism so far or perceived so far?
Yeah, I guess because with communism, Marxism, you know, there was the argument for, you know, workers will unite, you know, so the Soviet Union at the time argued, you know, look to us, America is not living up to it. So we actually respect, you know, people of different races, but with I guess the lack of kind of like a European ideology that's being the argument, is that part of the problem? Because other ideologies from other parts of the world are making that argument. But I wonder if it's not
Making the argument for
yeah, exactly.
So I don't know. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. And so, you know, oftentimes when we don't know, like we punt and cite other people's work. And so I think of Hywell's work. I just read his book. I think he's at Georgetown. He's very much. And well, so first of all, I love his book. Like beautifully written, really excellent book. But he actually is like, we need to look to sort of like global decolonization and sort of older, oftentimes African anti-imperialism. We need to think about reparation. So in the US, not entirely, but mostly reparations has often been like kind of a narrow Black nationalist project. He's like, we need to expand that, and we need to think about sort of global reparations, and we need to think about it forward in terms of adjusting for what the West has done in terms of global warming, how so I don't have a good answer to your question except to point to you to someone who's starting, I think along the lines of and that I found that.
Shannon, I noticed your hand was up, and then Alice.
Yeah, thank you. This was awesome. I have a sort of a meta question, which you gave us permission to ask in the beginning of your talk, which was about the movement of critical race theory from legal scholarship to the humanities and to the social sciences. So I guess I'm like interested to hear about that, but also I'm interested to hear if you think that plays a role in it being salient enough to have a backlash and to be weaponized.
So I'll start. Okay, let me clarify the question for the audience. So,
Sorry.
do I think it plays a role, that spread being salient enough for there to be a backlash? To that, I'll answer yes, right? What I think is complicated about like sort of the spread of ideas or how ideas spread is, you know, if you read like Crenshaw's work on how critical race theory started, Crenshaw's like, I was a African-American studies undergrad, and then I went to law school when I brought a bunch of ideas from African-American studies into the law, right? And then, so to say that those ideas sort of like then spread from critical race theory is kind of weird. I think there's a couple, so, you know, in the book, I talk about like ideas about structural racism have been around for a very long time, right? Ideas about the social construction of race, at least in social sciences, go back to like Boas and Du Bois, if not earlier, right? So these ideas were there in the literature. I think one thing that critical race theory did, and I would just look specifically to like Delgado and Stanchik here, is like they systematized it into like 5 or 6 like really short like social construction of race, right? Like these very short sort of descriptions of what it was, that then made it easier for scholars in other fields to say like, I'm taking these, doing a critical race analysis because I'm using it, right? But sort of like which direction those ideas flowed in is hard. But I definitely think the increasing number of folks across fields saying they're doing critical race theory contributes to this. And I would also say this is what makes it hard for folks to be like, well, no one's teaching this in high school, right? Or no one's teaching this at the elementary level, because if you, I mean, I don't know if you know kids learn about segregation, but in high school you might, right? And if you learn about sort of the history of segregation and structural racism, that idea is like now part of critical race theory, but it didn't necessarily originate there. And you can teach about structural racism without teaching sort of like any of the legal theorists to systematize critical. So I think as propagandists do, I think sort of like muddying waters around these ideas.
Alice, you had a question, then I can.
Oh, sorry, I'll let you.
So thank you so much for this talk. It really helped me clarify a lot of ideas that I have not been able to think about as clearly as you have. And so I studied this information, and it's been very unsurprising to me that there was this huge anti-CRT pushback after 2020. Like that, as you said, this has happened many times. And it similarly does not surprise me that Ron DeSantis and others have recycled this like very tired Anita Bryant-esque narrative that LGBTQ people are dangerous predators who are grooming, right? But the playbook for both of these backlashes has basically been exactly the same in terms of the kinds of moral panics that they've engendered, the kinds of legislation that they're going after, the focus on youth and children as white children, as these like innocent people who are being preyed upon by dangerous Black people, dangerous Antifa, dangerous drag queens, whatever. But thinking about this from your perspective, and also thinking about this from an intersectional perspective, because obviously there's lots of like people of color who are LGBTQ, how are these related? Because it's almost like there's this, you know, there's clearly a big difference between the history of racism and the history of homophobia in the United States. There's different histories, there's different sort of discourses that get activated. These two seem really similar. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts.
All right, so the question was, how is sort of the anti-CRT backlashing laws related to what I think was sort of like slightly substantive, somewhat overlapping that laws are right? Book bans cover all this and more. So how are they related? So it's the exact same people pushing both narratives. And I heard, so I don't remember who this was. I don't remember where I read it. But there was a discussion, actually, I think it was Wendell. So I actually think it was Wendell, who he was like, I started with critical race theory, that was really effective. I'm moving to this, even more incendiary and even more effective in areas sort of, right? So I'm not one to be like, this is more or less. But I would also add, in line with my argument, parallels very closely with laws and sort of tax. Argue, I mean, it's the same. Yeah. So yeah, I think same people, same strategy, and again, borrowing or remixing for the American.
We had a student question?
Yeah. So my question is about the parallel that you were drawing between sort of modern day 2020 activism combined with like global authoritarianism, the Cold War era, civil rights era, global convergence. And it seems like one meaningful distinction between those two eras, or where that parallel sort of falls apart, is that in the civil rights era, the backlash was the concrete pieces of legislation, whereas in 2020, even though it was this huge national uprising, it was not accompanied by this kind of systemic change or like landmark legislation, right? Like the police weren't, there wasn't big systemic meaningful change. So I was wondering how you thought that that difference affected the current backlash, and whether it makes the backlash stronger, more potent, or sort of what strategic, like how we can respond to it given that difference.
I think that's super interesting, because the question is, how are sort of the similarities and differences between the successes of the civil rights movement and that backlash, how do I sort of parse them out, right? One of the things that I like see as a problem that I've written about this so far is like having trouble periodizing it, right? I need to like choose out like when the sort of like triumphalism of the end of communism and the history thing like started to sort of turn into these more authoritarian states. Well, I think that I don't know. I think there has been a long sort of erosion of those victories of the civil rights movement that I think is part of this modern movement. But I don't think in 2013, when the Supreme Court like gutted the enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act, I did not see the conservative movement so openly pining towards authoritarianism in the way that they are now. But again, that's an issue of periodization. I also think you are absolutely right that like the backlashes that I've talked about in the paper were to sort of like concrete things, but there were also like tons of backlashes in the civil rights era to like trying to register, trying to go to school, right? Things that weren't necessarily concrete like that also. Like folks just trying to exercise basic rights. So I do think that, yeah, the threat of racial progress is enough to get some folks to react, right? Like Rufo was like, where this might be going, we can't have that.
Wonderful talk. I'm curious about how you feel like some of the arguments that you're presenting pair with the kind of market populism that I think has really sort of pervaded the last 25, 30 years, maybe longer, where the solutions come from, private citizens buying products, that support anti-racism rather than seeing them in the school system, or the emergence of this kind of figure of the entrepreneur who will solve it. And I want to be clear, but saying I don't see this as a positive thing, but I think that these things pair, right, in some ways where there is this suggestion that we should look outside of the outside of the political structure to an economic structure that will fail, but seems to be often presented as the kind of pathway forward.
Okay, so yes, the question is, how do my arguments pair with sort of like market as an institution?
Well, I'm wondering to what extent do you see the rhetoric of the market as solution kind of joining hands with this idea that we need to be with this kind of backlash against CRT, right? This sort of positioning of saying, at least from what I'm seeing, right, a lot of the sort of backlash against CRT around the book bans, around other things, is often paired with a similarly cynical argument that like there's these other opportunities available to address this, through the market for private citizens who are invested in these types of discourses, and so it's presented as not as that, as not completely shutting it down, but simply offering an alternate pathway.
So I understand the question. I don't think that it's all right. Like, I don't think the market can provide us.
No, I don't think the market price will be very clear. That's not what I'm wondering whether you're seeing in your research the pairing of these discourses, right? So that the idea somehow that the sort of backlash is also accompanied by an accompanying rhetoric that is trying to sort of suggest that the market will be a great leveler of all of these issues.
Yeah, so the folks at like the Manhattan Institute, yeah, they argue that, right? Like, and even like so I have a piece that came out a few weeks ago in which like I quote Rufo saying destroy, like the goal, excuse me, is to completely discredit public, right? And in order to privatize, and then one of the sort of like long-term conservative privatization rhetoric is like Black families would do great in charters, right? And so it is, it is tied to that on sort of like side of folks. I don't think like, okay, so there are always entrepreneurs who will like commodify whatever they can with capitalism, and like, are there folks doing that? Yes. Do I think that like provides a solution to?
I do wonder though, outside of sort of fairly, that to me it seems like the rhetoric of entrepreneurialism, has really kind of pervaded in a lot of spaces, right? So that there is like I often wonder about like the ideology of the market has sort of constraining real pushback against these things, right? That there is, when I call it market populism, I mean the way in which, across the board, right, cutting across lines of class, race, there is this sense of like, this notion that the market is useful, valuable, positive, has potential, ultimately kind of challenges the sort of work that was done in earlier eras during the civil rights to actually, the rights movement, for example, to push back against these kind of oppressive policies. I'm not sure there's a question there. It's just kind of a sense of like trying to see how these things correlate and how we mount resistance when oftentimes it feels like there's this investment in something that is not actually going to bring much change.
Do that, maybe we'll get I want to make space for some of the other students. Yeah, go ahead, and then Yvonne.
So, given that so much of the dispersed around what is taught schools, and given the existing limitation of power, when you teach students, you work with undergrads, especially, how do you incorporate critical race theory into your into what you teach, and what do you find, especially I guess, like, what do you feel like you have to work against the most that is coming out of
This is a good question. So the question was, how do I incorporate critical race theory into my teaching? Do I need to push back? So I started teaching like the week that Mike Brown was shot. And I was like prepping a class, and I looked on Twitter and saw Trump. I was prepping a lecture for my class titled Critical Race Theory, when I looked on Twitter and saw Trump had banned critical race theory, the sort of federal democracy, and like I had questions, right? Like I was like, can I go teach my class? That was the first question. So let me say this. This is like a very unfortunate thing that like these moments of the Black Lives Matter movement and backlash to critical race theory has, from my perspective, classes I teach, like only sort of deepened my students' curiosity and desire to understand what's going on in the world around them. Students won't like being lied to. Right? Students can see through a lot of misinformation and they, so for instance, this semester, I'm teaching a class on race and organizations. And on the introduction, I say, and you know, the side project, I did this book on critical race theory that just came out. Like a bunch of students came up to me after class, were like, what is this about? I can talk about it in class. So I have like, I kind of leaned into it, like the you know, Trump bans it, and I'm like, let me go write a book because I think this is important. That being said, you know, I'm tenured. I did go meet with like faculty, so with like leaders at my institution to make sure that within the bounds of what I do, exactly, because I am doing what I'm contracted to do as an educator. And my biggest worry is for people who lack those protections. Because I've had like a number of folks contact me and say, what are you doing? What are you change? And I'm like, I actually increased my sort of provocation. And they're like, well, I need to change my job. And that is a real concern. And that I would never like, people need to eat, right? And so I understand if you are changing sort of how they act in the classroom, how they, I think. The other thing I'll say, I've also talked with colleagues, said, I'm teaching the same way, I'm just avoiding certain terms, right? So I'm not talking about critical race theory, but I am talking about segregation, history of Jim Crow. I'm talking about things in ways to sort of meet the letter, but not the spirit of the book. And I also think that's a strategy. And even if I think about like many of the folks that cite, like boys, each show kind of, I don't know, backlash this kind of environment, they're open here. So yeah, I think if you do this kind of work, possibly.
Yvonne, you want to, I think unfortunately I have time for just one last question, but I can try to Yvonne and then if you want to go. Okay, all right, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's really wonderful. I have a niche question, which is that early on in your book, say that your goal in the book isn't necessarily to like debunk this propaganda or give attention to these propagandas. And I just want to hear a little bit about like how you go about doing that when talking about, you know, moral panics like this, propaganda like this.
Yeah, so I don't react to their arguments because their arguments are constant. Right. So as I was, so you're not going to find social scientists who studies race, or you're not going to find many of them who say that like racial inequality structurally. Right? It's not like you. So we disagree a lot on the causes, right? Like folks would be like, well, it's black people's fault, or other folks like me are like, I'm like centuries of like explicit state-sponsored segregation, right? So we disagree, but like you're not going to find folks who don't accept this sort of basic facts, and like these folks don't even accept the facts. And so I wrote a piece for Time, and I called it "Critical Race Theory's Merchants of Doubt." Because I don't know if you all know this book, Merchants of Doubt, which looks at how they used sort of right-wing think tanks to sort of like attack the consensus on things like global warming. And I'm like, look, there is a consensus that racial inequality is real, you're not, right? And like what they're doing literally updates the strategies of these Merchants of Doubt folks. And when I say like it literally updates the strategies, I keep mentioning Rufo, but Rufo used to work for the Discovery Institute, which if anyone remembers like the late 90s, the Discovery Institute was the group of folks who pushed, what did they call it? So they were trying to get intelligent design taught as a viable alternate theory to evolution in schools. So they did this thing in which they had these like propaganda campaigns saying like, teach the controversy, right? Well, among biologists, there's no controversy, just as among, sociologists, there's no controversy, right? But they knew that getting folks to believe that there were these two sides, the same thing with global warming, there's no controversy among like scientists who study global warming, right? But media frames it in this way that's like super misleading. So I just don't, it just doesn't make sense to engage with people who like are trying to construct a different reality than the reality as it actually exists. So, and I don't think you end up convincing people by engaging those arguments. I think you end up sort of platforming bad actors who actually want the legitimacy of a professor with a PhD engaging their arguments as if they are a serious person.
I think that's the best way to end this. Actually.
For a little bit longer, if y'all want to talk to each other, and then again, just remember there's books of his copies of his book available for you to take. So please do take them.
Yes, you too.
No, I know. It's like